Wow.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight for our virtual event with Jason Diamond in conversation with Alana Levinson. We're here to discuss the Sprawl. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this uncertain time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is tomorrow, Friday, September 25th at 6 p.m. with Elizabeth Lesser in conversation with Sally Field, and they will be discussing Cassandra Speaks. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on our website. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. They will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, please consider supporting our bookstore and our authors by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. To do that, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. We're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. Now, a little more about Jason. He is a sports editor at RollingStone.com and the founder of Volume 1 Brooklyn. His work has been published by the New York Times, BuzzFeed, Vulture, The New Republic, The Paris Review, Pitchfork, Esquire, Vice, and many others. And a little more about Alana. Alana is the deputy editor of the critically acclaimed new men's lifestyle publication, Mel, where she oversees long-form features, investigative work, and special issues. Her freelance writing has appeared everywhere from Rolling Stone to Vice to Wired, and she writes fiction, poetry, and what she calls questionable tweets in her free time. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Jason and Alana. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. I feel like we're Sally Field's warm-up act. She said Sally Field. I was like, what?
Yeah.
That's great.
A very well-dressed warm-up act, might I say.
Yeah, I would say so too. I'm very happy about this. All right, so I'll start reading and then we can just jump right into it. And
sure.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you again. So this is the start of chapter 1. The title of this chapter is We Were Promised Hoverboards. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a few minutes. The future isn't what it used to be. At least our interest in what the future might look like has changed, as has our enthusiasm. Every generation has to listen to the previous ones talk about the way it used to be, but people don't want to speculate on what will be as much as they used to. Imagining how the future will look in 10, 20, 50 years was, especially after World War II, an American obsession. There was the Leave It to Beaver and station wagon life portrayed in photographs by Mary L. Parker on the covers of House Beautiful and Better Homes and Gardens magazines. There was also the Jetsons with their flying cars and robot maid. People dreamed of not only having men walk on the moon, but also someday living on other planets. And that vision often looked suburban. In 1957, when Walt Disney Imagineering and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, with thanks to their sponsor, Monsanto, showed us the house of the future, where microwaves ensured everything is done just at the right amazing speed, and furniture made of practical but comfortable, serviceable yet beautiful plastic, it was suburban. There was a lot of enthusiasm about how things would look someday, and the future could often be found in the suburbs. The stereotypical mid-century picture of the white middle-class family and their perfect normal lives was the past, present, and future model of the country that companies and advertisers wanted to portray. After the chaos and bleakness of the 60s and 70s, there was an understandable desire for a time when Americans were intrigued by what could be. A cursory look at the politics and pop culture landscape of the decade shows that in the 80s, people yearned for a past that was enamored with the future. From the former movie star running the country to one of the highest grossing films of the decade, Back to the Future, taking viewers back to the Eisenhower administration. And while the Greed is Good decade had more than its fair share of films set during the formative years of the baby boomers, Back to the Future offers a cool teenager going back 30 years from 1985 to 1955, getting his parents together, saving the life of his friend Dr. Emmett Brown, altering the future, and possibly inventing skateboarding. Michael J. Fox's Marty McFly is one of the great film characters of the 1980s, And the movie is the type of classic that's almost certainly playing somewhere in the world every minute of every day. But Back to the Future also provides a perfect encapsulation of the rise and fall of the American suburbs throughout the first half of the trilogy's opening film. Something that gets lost in the discussions of the best lines and the DeLorean time machine and debates over what the movie got right and wrong about the 2000s. It's dusk when Marty rolls home on his skateboard. The camera pulls back to show us the entrance of Lyon Estates, a subdivision in the fictional California town of Hill Valley. A lone street lamp illuminates the wide stretch of pavement. The houses are pushed back from the curb. There are massive power lines in the distance, and there's a couple of trees on the block. Hardly anything natural about it. It's unremarkable in every way. The shot is painted in a bluish gray because of the time of day, but it's fair to assume the streetscape always looks that way. It's lonely. Something you realize after you've watched enough movies and TV shows about the suburbs is that they're often shot that way. At the front of the development's entrance, a pair of lion statues keep watch. It's hard to tell, but they're pretty weathered from the California sun, and nobody cares enough to fix them up. Lyon Estates has seen better days. There's an Edward Hopper quality to the whole shot, a lot more of it to unpack if you're willing. But of course, there's not much reason to do that if you're just watching the film to see Marty cruising the space-time continuum and looking cool, which is totally reasonable since that is what the movie is about. Marty is bored. His family is at the lower end of the middle, and his life in Hill Valley is unfulfilling. His brother works at Burger King. His sister doesn't seem to do anything. His dad is a nebbish with some low-level number-crunching job, and his mom is a burned-out housewife who likes to start cocktail hour a few hours earlier than she should. It's a middling existence, one Marty desperately wants to escape. The little one-floor ranch home with transmission towers in the backyard that are probably frying his brain. It isn't so much that there's much wrong with the house itself, which is a real home on a real street in San Fernando Valley lined with pickup trucks owned by mostly working-class neighbors. Rather, it's what the house and the neighborhood have become in the film and what they've come to represent. Deterioration, the American dream stripped of all of its sheen. This is the future that Marty will try to get back to. When Marty goes back 30 years to 1955, we see a very different version of his hometown. His Lyon Estates subdivision is still an empty chunk of land that will soon be filled with houses and concrete, with a bucolic background filled in by trees and hills. There is a sign with an illustration of a perky white nuclear family and the slogan, "Live in the house of tomorrow, today." That and the lion statues at the main entrance, which look like they're standing watch. The 1955 version is vibrant and more alive than the stale and forgotten 1985 version. When Marty walks the 2 miles into town, the little Eisenhower-era Hill Valley downtown is Main Street, USA, the type of place where young men in spotless uniforms run out to service any car that visits the gas station, and people are out walking around enjoying their town. Hill Valley 1985 is mostly desolate and falling apart, with trash blowing everywhere, and the movie theater showing porn on a big screen that, in 1955, is playing Cattle Queen of Montana starring Barbara Stanwyck and Ronald Reagan for 50 cents. Yes, this is largely baby boomer nostalgia for a time when the owner of Lou's Cafe could crack, "A colored mayor, that'll be the day," when the African-American busboy says he'd like to be mayor of the town someday. The character, Goldie Wilson, is in fact the mayor of Hill Valley in Marty's 1985. But the juxtaposition of the two Hill Valleys paints an adequate picture of suburbia's boom and bust in the decades after the Second World War. Coming just a few years after the end of the Vietnam War, the gas shortages, and the Iran hostage crisis, and in the final years of the Cold War, the 1985 version of Hill Valley also represents the disillusionment Americans felt everywhere. From farmers in rural areas dealing with one financial heartache after another as exports fell and interest rates in farm equipment rose, to urbanites struggling with crumbling buildings and skyrocketing crime rates. The breakdown of the suburbs encapsulates all that. Baked into the selling of the suburbs in the middle of the 20th century was that they were a change, an escape from the problems of small town and big urban centers. At a time when the suburbs, the American dream, were showing signs of decline, Back to the Future summed up the suburban zeitgeist better than most people might have realized. All right.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you're drinking seltzer.
Drinking some Topo.
Love it.
Yeah.
You curated that.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sure.
I really did. This is just really on brand. This is just like a normal night in for me. I swear to God. Didn't even think.
I thought we could start off with you telling us a little bit about your personal story and your upbringing in the suburbs and sort of what made you want to write this book, if you remember a specific moment.
Well, my own personal upbringing was, I always tell people I grew up and down the lake around Chicago. I was born in Skokie, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. And my parents got divorced pretty early on. So I moved from like one suburb to the next, all kind of in the same area. But, you know, I never really felt at home in one place or another. So I'd always kind of use that to say, I hate these places. I don't want to live here. I want to go somewhere else. And then I would, and then I'd miss the place that I lived previously. And so, you know, my childhood was pretty unhappy. You know, there was a lot of, my parents got divorced early. You know, there's a lot of really kind of bummer stuff that happened. I wrote about it a little bit in this book and in my first book. And, you know, so I just kind of grew to hate where I was from. I mean, we all kind of do, I think, but I think I especially was like, I gotta get out of here. You know, screw the suburbs. I'm going to the city. And so I did. And basically my entire adult life has been in cities. It's been Chicago and New York since I was 17. So, you know, I kind of just put the suburbs in the rearview mirror and didn't think about them for a long time. And then I started going back to the suburbs because my wife's family live in suburban Connecticut. And I would be like, oh, this isn't so bad. This isn't as bad as I thought it was. You know, it's nice. It's quiet. There's not some guy masturbating on the train. You know, like little things like that, which you do miss and you don't miss when you're not in a city. But, you know, and then my first book came out and it was a memoir, and it was about my obsession with growing up in the suburbs that gave us all the John Hughes and all the teen movies of the 80s, and kind of like the kind of weirdness of being a teen in this supposedly perfect suburban place, and your teenage life is anything but that. So when the book came out, because I don't think a lot of people get to read your book when they come to your reading, because, you know, it just come out and not everyone is obsessively into reading books. The minute they come out, people who had read it would come up to me and I just expect them to want to talk about like the movies or whatever. And they'd always talk to me about being a weirdo from the suburbs. And it just kind of like dawned on me that there's a whole lot of people who are like weirdos from the suburbs, and people who feel bad about being from the suburbs, and just kind of got me thinking about how much the suburbs have given us and how little we've, you know, given the suburbs any sort of, I don't want to say respect, but just sort of like a real hard look, like why they're the way they are and why people from the suburbs create the things they do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm, you know, just for context for me and why I'm so excited that you asked me is because I've never lived in a suburb.
Right.
I grew up in San Francisco, then I went to college in Boston, then I lived in New York for a long time. So, you know, we have very different, you know, my understanding of the suburbs is basically just through the stereotypes and like what you see in movies and all that stuff. And I was telling you the other day that like, I definitely romanticized it the way someone from the suburbs would romanticize.
Yeah.
But yeah, something that I found really interesting in the book is you talk a little bit about like this anxiety and dread and sadness that feels sort of emblematic of growing up in the suburbs. And I was reading it and I was like, I felt all those same things too. Wow. Even though I was in San Francisco, I felt anxiety. I was bored, even though we had tons of stuff to do. I was bored of doing the same old thing. I hated it. I couldn't wait to go. I was like, even if you live in a city, then you're like, well, it's not New York. I want to move to New York. San Francisco's lame. So I was like how much of that is actually about the place and how much of that is about age, being a teen, or class. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I think I'd mentioned this to you, but I think the only people who I've ever met who don't hate where they're from tend to be New Yorkers, like born and raised New Yorkers are sort of like, yeah, New York City, it's the best place in the world. I think it's really easy to hate where you grow up. There's just something like if you get to kind of see the ins and outs of a place at this age, especially like when you're like in that really sensitive, like 12 to 17 age where you're questioning everything and just everything seems, I hate to like be like a stereotype here and use like the catcher in the rye term, but everything just seems phony, everything just seems like off to you. I think it's totally normal for that. It doesn't matter where you're from. And I mean, the thing is, it's like, there's a lot of cities, there's like, we tend to think about it, like you mentioned New York and San Francisco and LA and Boston is like, I think a smaller big city, but like still a city. But, I'm imagining like kids in like Tulsa, Oklahoma, probably are like, this is the most boring town in the world. Why am I in this? It's like, I have friends, like you watch like Richard Linklater films and it's Austin and you're like, oh, Austin's Austin. Everyone wants to live in Austin. It's such a cool place. But the whole point of those movies is it's just a boring place. Doesn't matter if it's a city. It looks suburban and some of his films look suburban, but it's just what you make of it, and
yeah, I totally agree.
You just want to get out.
People say that about San Francisco. They're like, oh, are you going to move? Why wouldn't you move back? It's so cool you're from there. And I'm like, it's still my hometown. Like there's still, yes, I grew up in Noe Valley, but there's still the Noe Valley Tavern where like everyone I knew from high school goes. And like, I'd rather die than go there. Do you know what I'm saying? And like,
oh yeah,
I still have that same anxiety when I'm home for Christmas and I'm like going to the bakery and I like run into the person. I'm like, oh God, so you can't escape that. And I think also like, as someone who also had a traumatic childhood, that really colors, like the experience you have in a place really colors your perception of it. So I don't know if I would have I did love growing up in San Francisco. But I also like, it scares me how much access I had to dangerous stuff at such a young age.
Yeah.
And I never know, like when I was younger, people were like, that's because, because San Francisco used to be a little more rough around the edges. You could do drugs, but then you also heard about like suburban kids going nuts. So I'm always like, if I had grown up in the suburbs, like, would I have been more troubled or less? I don't know.
That's the thing. It's like, that's in the suburbs. It's the lack of access, I think, that's dangerous. Right. I mean, the messed up stuff that, I was telling a friend, like, well, my wife is from New England. And so, she's always talking about like the opioid epidemic in New England. And it's a terrible thing. But I'm like, I remember kids getting like deep into like painkillers when I was like a freshman in high school, like just because like that was all that was around. And it's kind of weird because like a lot of the music and a lot of the culture that I like celebrates that kind of like getting messed up. And like I love the Ramones, and like the Ramones have songs about sniffing airplane glue because there's nothing else. And it's fun when it's the Ramones, but when it's a bunch of like dorky kids with nothing to do and an hour outside of Chicago, it becomes tragic. And that's kind of the weird thing about the suburbs. Ooh, there's a dirt bike outside my window, which is pretty dope. But yeah, I think the lack of access, I think about it a lot. I'm just getting to the point now where I'm starting to see people I've known in the cities dying more, which is sad. As I get older, like I think people's lives are catching up to them. Somebody I knew, I found out last night, died, and I was like, oh, that's really sad. But he was like hard partying, but in the suburbs, people started dropping. I don't mean to use that term, be insensitive, but I knew people who died of overdoses when I was like 16, and
Yeah,
it's hard, man.
That's so interesting because I always say everyone I grew up with is either in a 12-step program or dead. And I was always like, is that a city thing? But I think, no, I think it's just maybe like I would have found the misfits anywhere I went, you know,
Yeah.
and the punk kids and the kids that came from broken homes.
Yeah, people tend to, that's, I mean, birds of a feather, you know, that whole thing. Like, that's just how it is. I mean, you're always, that's the reason, like today, I mean, I'm 40 and I'm still drawn to the things I'm drawn to and the kind of people I'm drawn to, you know, because I just like what I like, and I like people who like what I like, and I like people who want to talk about these things. And, you know, I'm, in a lot of ways, I'm still the same person I was when I was 15, except I'm not a homeless teenager, and I, you know, have a job. I guess a couple of things are good, but yeah, besides that, you know, I'm still kind of the misfit weird kid, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue because I wanted to talk a little bit about gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and this idea that, I mean, that the suburbs were a very white place. Obviously, that partially comes from Levittown, where there were actual like rules against people of color being able to like buy those houses in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that when we were talking a couple days ago, you said that you actually think that the suburbs are more diverse than people give them credit for. I thought maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like one thing, you know, and the suburbs have been diversifying over the years. There was a term coined in the mid to late 90s called ethnoburbs, and it was I forget what part of Asia, but I think shoot, I'm gonna totally screw this up, but it was more first generation immigrant Asian people moving to the suburbs and kind of changing the face of the suburbs. But, you know, a lot of outer ring suburbs, we don't think about this, but like places that we think are St. Louis, or we think are Chicago, or we think are Los Angeles, are oftentimes suburbs. And the reason they're not considered suburbs is because we have this idea of what a suburb is. You know, I write early on in the book about this one suburb outside of Chicago that's like literally like on the border of Chicago, and it's I think like 70% black. It has been for years. But the thing that I noticed when I was writing this, when I was researching the book, was what interested me was the suburbs closer to the city are more diverse. The further out you get from the city, the whiter they do get, which I was like, that's really kind of, that's where to me, like there is no real, like we do have in like in surveys and stuff like, oh, do you live in the suburbs? Do you live in a rural area? Do you live in an urban area? But it's really kind of hard to define what a suburb is besides saying it's outside of the city. So it could be in the inner ring or the outer ring of a city. It could be its own entity, whatever. But the further out you got, the whiter it got. And that was really weird to me. And I think once you start kind of seeing that change, I think that's going to be a really big sea change in America. If we get to that, I don't even know how far America is going to get in the next few years, but I think it's a great thing. Like when you go to like Houston and you go outside of Houston and you see Indian families and, you know, Korean families and all these just different kinds of people. I think that's really important. It's a great thing because the suburbs as a place for white people, considering the fact that 53% of people in America consider themselves suburban, I think breaking down that idea is really important.
Yeah, me too. And I think just to talk a little bit about gentrification and sort of like when we were growing up, or at least my understanding of the city was a place where all the culture was. It was a place where there was diversity of class, diversity of race, diversity of interests, a lot of different things to do. It was where all the stores that were independent could be. Like I thought of suburbs as like a place where there's Target, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, over the course of my lifetime, for example, I've seen sort of, the insane gentrification of my hometown, but also in New York. And what's happened to streets like Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn, or even my main street, 24th Street in San Francisco, where the rents have gotten so high that actually anyone who's a creative has had to move out. I mean, that's part of why I don't move back to San Francisco. I could never afford to be a journalist and live there.
Yeah.
So you have all the creatives leaving, and the only people that can, and I think a lack of diversity ensuing from how high the rent is. And then on top of that, in terms of like stores and culture, the only stores that can afford their rent, and this has all been exacerbated, by the way, by COVID, are these big box stores. And so the cities, in some ways, like there are parts of like Manhattan that feel like a suburb to me. And then on the other hand, we're seeing so many people, like, I feel like it started with like Etsy, where like a lot of like creatives were just like moving to small towns, and they were like, I'm going to have my fucking Etsy store. And they have way better lives because their rent is like $400 a month. And if you're in New York, it's like an insane amount.
My Etsy store did not work out in New York.
Yeah. The rent is too damn high. But I've heard it's gone down since I lived there.
By New York standards, it's like, yeah. I still wouldn't suggest anybody move here if they don't have money.
With COVID now, all these issues I'm discussing have just like turned up the dial. I mean, your book is really ahead of its time, because I feel like I know so many people who are just like, fuck it, I'm moving back to the suburbs with my parents. I can work online, or I'm moving to even like a smaller city. Where my rent, like what, I mean, I do all this weird where I like look at like Santa Fe and like rural New Mexico, because you can buy an amazing house for really cheap, and I'm like, why not? You know?
Yeah, it's beautiful there too.
I mean, your whole book is about all kind of like the amazing art and stuff that comes out of the suburbs already, but like, is that going to be even more exaggerated, do you think, post-COVID? Or do you think the diehard creatives will stay in cities?
I mean, you know, part of like, well, one thing that I try to look at, I try not to be like, I try not to like take this utopian view of the suburbs, being like, oh, you know, people move back to the suburbs and they're going to be this place where like, you know, you're going to see like Buffalo Grove, Illinois is going to have an artistic boom, or, you know, something like that. But something I was thinking about actually like today, because I was reading about like all the music venues in New York are pretty much, you know, gone at this point. I mean, I think somebody was like referring to something. They're like, it's the last DIY venue in New York. And I was like, what? That's crazy. Like when I moved here, there was like, you can go see a show like in a Burger King or something, you know, everywhere you went in New York, there was like a Todd P show or something.
Todd P. Okay. I came right at the height of Todd P.
Right. Yeah.
And
everyone. Yeah.
The fact that I'm not dead right now because one of those like clearly not up to code buildings didn't light on fire while we were in it is a miracle. But yeah, Todd P. That was like a different era, right? Yeah,
but like, you know, at least there will be venues again, I assume. I don't know if there'll be like all ages venues in New York. I have no idea what the musical landscape's going to look like after this. But the thing is, when you go out to the suburbs, there's always going to be basements. There's always going to be garages. You know, I was reading all this stuff over the last few years about like all these I always like all these Latinx or Latino, I forget, but I don't want to mess up the terminology, but like all these like Latino punk kids in Los Angeles having these like huge backyard shows. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's awesome. Like that's still happening. Like that's amazing that's going to keep happening. And like there's this big like punk scene of like Mexican American kids in Los Angeles. Like, okay, that's good. We need more of that. And then, you know, I'll read about like kids starting like, you know, these kids who have like SoundCloud followings of like tens of thousands of people, and it's just some dorky kid in their bedroom in, you know, some Michigan suburb, you know, stuff like that. It's always going to happen. And what's going to be interesting to me is when those kids kind of either get older or they get famous, are they going to want to move to the cities? I mean, I'm guessing they probably will, but it would be cool if there was reason for them to stay in the suburbs. I just don't know if that's going to happen. But, you know, with people moving to the suburbs, that's been happening. It's not like a brand new thing. Like the trend was kind of swinging. Like if millennials, for the last like 5 years, if millennials were going to buy a house, it was more likely they were going to buy it in the suburbs instead of the city because, like you were saying, it's unaffordable. So, I mean, this was going to happen, just not the way, obviously there was no way of expecting what's happening now to happen, but it was swinging that way slowly. But COVID definitely pushed everything into a whole new light.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering if like the differentiation even between all these different types of places are even as big, vast as they used to be, for example, you know? Like the suburb, I guess in the 50s felt very distinct from the city. And now there are certain suburbs where like they might kind of feel like a small city.
Have you been to Williamsburg in the last like 2 years?
I went like a couple years ago and it really freaked me out.
I took a picture of it, but like somebody like tagged something like Williamsburg is the suburbs. Mm-hmm. Like it's gotten to that point where it's like, oh yeah, it does kind of have this like weird feel to it.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah, I thought it was a really weird. I almost wanted to like use that for a title.
There's a whole other book that you should write about like the smaller cities outside of cities where no one can decide, like Berkeley, like Oakland. Like is Berkeley what I think? So for me, it's like anything that's not in San Francisco is a suburb, which is not true. But that's like a weird city kid mentality where a lot of kids who grew up in Manhattan, for example, are like Manhattan diehards, and Brooklyn isn't as much of like they don't see it as much of a thing as like some like me. I'm like Brooklyn and Manhattan. They're both the same place to me. I mean, they're different, but like they're both the same city.
Well, yeah, but people call Manhattan the city.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going.
You know, it's like it's funny.
So I'm always fascinated by that, and like Berkeley kids love to like make it seem, you know, like they're from like I'm from Berkeley. It's like not town. It's very town-like to me though, but I understand that it's sort of not right. Is it a suburb?
It's a college town. I mean, I told you I have some familiarity with Berkeley from when I was a kid, and Berkeley to me like definitely has its own vibe. You know, Berkeley, like it felt very almost like I was like, there's so many people here who have like New York accents. Like there's a lot of like, this was back in like the 80s, but like you had a lot of like transplants who were professors and writers and stuff. And, but Berkeley definitely has its own feel, but it's a college town. I mean, it is, I don't know if I would call it a city, but I mean, I think if you were to like, if you look at it from like the perspective of like, if you took the college out of Berkeley, what would you have? Like
cultural wasteland.
Yeah, you would have anything. So
sorry,
you know, I think that
anyone. I love Berkeley. I went there, so
Berkeley rules. I love it. But like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like I think that's a really good signifier of like what would a place be if it didn't have, and like New York or San Francisco now, it's like it's everything. Everyone brings up the tech stuff, like, which is fair. Like, if you didn't have the tech stuff, what would you have? You would probably have the city that you remember.
Right.
You know, in New York, it's like New York thankfully has a lot of different stuff. It's just a lot of that stuff is very much in flux these days. So like media and publishing.
Yeah. What's interesting though is like we're talking shit about Berkeley, but like there was a club called Gilman on Gilman Street in Berkeley, where as you know, where Green Day got its start because they were from there. And so like I remember, you know, like going to Gilman, I thought it was super cool. And there was like a whole culture around that. So if we didn't have I don't know, we wouldn't have Green Day.
Yeah, no, I mean Gilman is like, to me, it's like that was the mecca when I was a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I like, and that was like the thing, like when I was a kid, reaching out to like record like Lookout Records was in Berkeley, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
would like I was stuck in the suburbs, and I would write them a letter, and they would send me a poster. I remember the Lookout Records, I still look for them on eBay. Their catalog was this really dope poster, and on the back was the catalog, and I just would memorize everything on that catalog. And I'm like, I need to hear every one of these bands. I need to go out to Berkeley. I need to see them at Gilman Street.
Yeah.
And you know, that was like how I was. Like, I just wanted to experience everything that wasn't around, like I didn't have access to at the time.
Right.
And, you know, I got lucky because, I mean, I'm like, I always joke, I'm like, I'm either the youngest Gen Xer or I'm the oldest millennial. So I had the internet when I was pretty young, but not young enough. Like if I'd had it a few years earlier, I don't know what I'd be like, but, you know, getting the internet was like, oh crap, there's actually people out there who are cool and want to talk to me and tell me about stuff. And that, you know, that was huge.
Yeah. That reminds me to talk like you know, a big portion of your book about sort of the art that comes out of the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking about, so I lived in a city, and I was like into punk and all that stuff, and I was really into Bay Area hip hop. So there's also that. I was like super into the music from San Francisco and the Bay Area, but I was
like the coup? Is like the coup from San Francisco? Like that's Boots Riley. That's Boots Riley.
Oh,
Yeah. I love that stuff.
And then, sorry, I'm trying to remember. Oh,
yeah,
but
sorry.
Also, this was also at the height of pop punk, and so much of the music I listened to was like from the perspective of like a bored shithead teen boy who's like just like ollieing in like empty parking lots and like going to malls and like mooning people. And like I related it to it so much. Blink 182, for example, or even Green Day. I related to it so much. And I went to Warped Tour when I was a teen, and like the All American Rejects and all of this, I mean, I don't even want to, I could go on and on about.
No, this is the stuff that I like. So
like cool suburban music from like, I'm talking like real bad, like, you know.
Well,
Anyway,
Blink-182 is definitely not bad.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Some people disagree.
I know. Well, you know, whatever.
On here who disagrees and is like, can't believe that they're like, still one of my favorite bands, but whatever. I agree. Look, I agree with you. Oh, he's commenting. They're amazing. But like, I've been researching a piece that I've been working on forever, just about like how they came up, and like, it's such a classic American story, you know, in the suburbs of San Diego. I forget which one. One got kicked out of his high school because he went to a basketball game drunk. So he had to go to this other high school, and that's where he met like the only other punk kid there through like his hot sister, and that was like Mark Hoppus. And then they became best friends and started a band, and like the rest is history. And I'm like, I do totally agree that like that all that stuff, like I never really thought of it as suburban, but it is. It very much is. I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that, maybe particularly when it comes to music.
Yeah, I mean, I dedicated this whole chapter because I've kind of been obsessed with like, you know, the kind of connection between like how all of American music kind of finds its way to connect with the past, I guess. And, you know, to me, this really kind of fascinating link is like garage rock in the 1960s. And I use this chapter to sort of like, I think I link like garage rock to 80s hardcore to like the beginnings of like electronic music in the suburbs outside of Detroit, to all the way to like a lot of like the SoundCloud stuff you get today. And it's like, it's all through the suburbs, because, you know, garage rock was a bunch of white kids trying to make black music, but doing it through the white dudes they heard it from. So it's like a bunch of white kids who heard the Rolling Stones covering like Bo Diddley and not realizing who the hell Bo Diddley was. But they're like, oh yeah, we could do that. We could, you know, and that's why you hear all these like nerdy, like 16-year-old, just like horny teenage boys from 1967 doing this kind of music. And it's like kind of genius because it's not, it's usually not that great, but it also is. And it's just this like sort of like give no fucks. We're just going to do this because we want to get girls to like us music. And there's something so kind of awesome about that. I mean, some of it's great. There's like some garage rock from the 60s is just like mind-blowing stuff. But then there's like some of it was it's just not good at all, but I appreciate the not good at all stuff. And for me particularly, and you know, this is the thing with why I kind of appreciate Blink-182 is because then you bump up about 15, 20 years and you get to like early 80s hardcore. So you get like bands like Black Flag or Social Distortion or The Adolescents or Bad Religion. And most of those bands were from the suburbs. And, you know, it's like songs about hating Reagan and hating your parents and hating the jocks and hating racists. And it's like, it's not really like, some of it's actually, I mean, like Bad Religion, like the lead singer went on to be he's a professor. You know, Milo from the Descendants is, I think, a scientist or something. He's a genius. So some of it's really great, but like, it's also just really just like, it's very emotional. You know, it's just like, it's pretty, not the best, not the most technically proficient music, you know, and I grew up listening to it. Like I grew up in the 90s, but like 80s hardcore influenced everything I listened to when I was a kid. And, you know, just so much of it. I mean, not all of it is from the suburbs, but a good bulk, the good bulk of it is. And the one that really got me was like the Misfits, who were like one of my favorite bands ever. Because I went to Glenn Danzig's hometown and I was like, this is where Glenn Danzig is from. It's just like some boring, like it's a very Italian, like old school New Jersey suburb. And, you know, I was expecting it to look like the Addams Family mansion just as a town. But it's just, they were just bored suburban kids who liked B movies and they just did their own thing. And that's kind of the beauty of most of the stuff that comes out of the suburb is it's just the suburbs is that you don't really know, you have an idea of what's cool, but you're not like faced with it every day. Like you're not walking out. It's not like Los Angeles or New York where you walk outside and everyone's really cool looking and everyone's, you know, cooler than you and doing something cooler than you and, you know, whatever. But there's just something kind of innocent about that. And I kind of, even though the Misfits like saying all this like weird fucked up stuff, but there's something kind of innocent about it to me. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just Blink, sorry, I'm just in Blink-182 land because I've researched them a lot. But like, for example, you know, through their music, especially like pre-9/11, we see them like grappling with a lot of like the big issues that were like really big in like white suburbia at the time. So there's like Together for the Kids, which is all about divorce, which at the time, remember, we were like the divorce generation, and that was like sort of like an edgy new thing. There's Adam's song about suicide, you know?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So like a lot of those sort of more suburban kind of problems were addressed in the music that I think's really fascinating. And what else? Oh, another thing that you made me think of is like, you know, I don't know if this is true for every city kid, but like I didn't know anyone because our houses were small and we didn't have basements that like had a drum set. So
really?
The only kid I knew who had one was really rich and had a mansion, and he had like his whole basement. But like I knew a lot of kids that play guitar, not really piano. It's just like interesting to think about like, yeah, like, and also none of us had cars. I don't know where we would have even like driven the amps, like how we would have even gotten them to a venue. So it's cool to think about like having a literal garage where you could actually hang out with your friends.
I mean, I remember like, cause I was in high school when like ska like really started to take off, and the Chicagoland area was like ska central. So like every day there was just like a new ska band, and it was like, oh, this is. I have a real like. I'm an unabashed like I'm fine with third wave ska. It was like always playing at parties when I was 15 or 16, or every friend I had was in a ska band at some point. So I have no problem with it. Like some, it's easy to make jokes about ska. But the funny thing was in the suburbs, especially in the suburbs, if you start a ska band, you need a horn section. So it's like all of a sudden, like these kids who were like, and I played clarinet when I was a kid, so I'm not making fun of kids in band, but like, it was like the kid who plays trumpet, or who played trumpet for like 2 years and still has the trumpet. Suddenly he's in like this really popular band in your high school because he plays trumpet, and the ska band just happened to need a trumpet player.
That's hilarious.
And that was like, I just remember that happening like way too often. Like, man, how is that like kid who plays the trombone so popular now? Like, because he's in a ska band.
Yeah, I mean, just for context, like I went to a private international school. We didn't have a band. We didn't have football. We didn't even have all of these things.
Oh man, you missed like the football stuff.
Yeah.
Like that's like peak. That is like.
Well,
that's
think
a weird
about it. Like a school downtown. It's like, where are they going to put a football field?
Yeah.
To practice, like there wasn't even like a lawn that we sat on. Like we had a rooftop that like overlooked the city. That was like where we ate lunch. Super weird.
Yeah, it's so weird to me. I mean, like I don't know. Like I started going to the city. Like I mean, I unlike a lot of kids I knew, I had a lot of exposure to the cities. Like I mean, I grew up going to cities, and I had family in the cities, and it wasn't like it was like a new thing to me. But like, I think there were times in my life where I thought I was more city than I really was. Like when I remember I was like 15, I remember my friend and we visited New York, and this was like a year after Kids came out, the movie Kids, which,
oh my God,
which all my friends and I saw, and we were like, that's us, man. We're like those kids, but like, the suburbs, we weren't. We totally like
watched that movie. Like the one time I watched it, it triggered me because it reminded me so much of growing up in San Francisco, where I was like, I can't watch this movie.
Oh, it's really hard I tried rewatching it like a couple of years ago. And man.
I'm thinking about how Chloe really is like 12 when she's filming that or whatever. Like she's
she's definitely, she's great in that though. But yeah, I don't know. Like I remember we went to New York, we brought our skateboards, and we took the train from Long Island into the city, and we got super lost trying to like find our way around New York, even though I'd been in New York a bunch of times. And I remember we're like, we got to find Union Square. That's where all the dudes from Kids are. We're going to skate with them. And I remember we showed up to you, and this was like 1996 or 7. We showed up there with like our skateboards and like our like cargo pants with like punk patches on them, and our like hoodies and stuff. And we were like, what's up, guys? Want to skate? And those kids just like laughed us out of there. And that was, to me, like, that was like where I was like, oh, I'm definitely a suburban kid, because I just, there's just something they smelled on us or something. And like, just.
Yeah, you can always tell. That's why I can still to this day, when someone's like, or they say they're from San Francisco, I'm like, oh, really? In the city? And everyone asks me that, because so many kids from like Marin pretend they're from San Francisco, but they're not. Right. And you can tell there's just a slight difference.
Well, I was telling you the other night, I was like, I had to do a lot of driving around Silicon Valley, and like, I didn't know what, like, I thought it was like San Francisco and like a little bit outside of San Francisco, but I'm like, Silicon Valley is it's like mostly suburbs.
Yeah, it's a waste. I mean, I actually don't think I've been there. Like, I don't know. Yeah. Like, maybe one time. But
yeah,
it's not like what. Like, first of all, now it's a booming like tech. But like, why would anyone go there other than that?
Yeah, I mean, the one that I was obsessed with was I write about is San Mateo, because it was the basis of one of my favorite movies, and I was like, I can't believe that like this. I mean, I guess I understand from like the like late 1960s, early 70s, like if there's like a handful of kids like breaking city property and like tagging stuff, like in 1971, I'm sure that's really traumatizing.
Mhm.
But I'm like, I don't really think this was like the center of like crazy illicit teen activity like
No,
people made it out to be.
definitely not. I think that's all for my question. Does anyone in the audience have a question that you want to type in for Jason to answer?
Hey guys.
Hey.
So we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
I do have a question though. So what do you make of the Valley of LA, of the Valley in LA? Would you consider that a suburb, or would you consider that a second city? It's such an important part of living in LA. So I don't know how much time you spent there, but like, what would you consider?
I spent a lot of time in LA even before writing this book, and I think somebody made this. I guess there's like a saying about LA, like it's not a city, it's like a bunch of like suburbs. I think somebody said that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot of, but the Valley to me definitely felt suburban. I mean, there were a lot of parts of Los Angeles that I was like, oh, this is like just as influential in our like Sherman Oaks, like places like that.
Mhm.
I was like, these are places that are just as instrumental in our understanding of the modern suburbs as like where I grew up, like the mall culture from those places and all that kind of stuff. I was really like, I was really surprised at how, like once you get off the expressways, like just how suburban a lot of those places feel. But like on the expressways, everything feels very close together because you're on the same part of this expressway for like 30 minutes. I just had to make one LA traffic joke. But I was kind of surprised at how many places, especially like the Valley, seemed incredibly suburban to me. But I also kind of like had this idea that like places like that, I kind of knew going into it that that was the case. And then there's like further out, like places I hope I'm getting this right. I think Huntington Beach is LA. Yeah. Like that was like, I was like, oh, I thought it was gonna be like a beach town, but like that's really suburban and
it's also very
white
and conservative.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Whereas the Valley is very super diverse, even arguably more diverse than the city, which is very interesting. We do have a question. It says, how long did this book take to write, and did you know early on what its shape would look like, or did it change and evolve along the way?
I actually had a pretty tight turnaround on writing it. I think I had 9 months to write the book.
Oh, wow.
But I'd been researching it kind of on and off. You know, a lot of it was stuff that I've definitely like just kind of put away in my head, and I just think way too. I'm an overthinker. Like I just kind of sit around and just overthink things. So I would say the research probably was about 1.5 years, 2 years worth of research, and then the writing was. I write all the time, so it wasn't the hardest thing in the world to do. But I do think that I had initially kind of seen more of like I thought it was going to tie together a little bit more. Like I didn't think it was going to be so. It is more essays. I didn't really think that was going to be the case. But as I started writing it, I was like, oh, I need to free myself up a little bit. I got to kind of like, let go of the dream of having like a book that just everything ties together nicely, because that's just not how, like the subject doesn't tie together nicely.
Exactly. So, it's very much form reflects subject.
Yeah. I mean, I've never, like, it was like I said about my first book, I never thought I would write a memoir, and then I did. I kind of had a sneaking suspicion I probably will write another book of essays at some point if somebody wants to ever put out another one of my books, but because I seem to have like bad luck with books, because my first book came out 2 weeks after Trump got elected, and this book came out like 2 months before this whatever hellhole we're entering.
Well,
and the hell we're in.
what was the name of your first book again?
Searching for John Hughes.
Searching for John Hughes. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you have anything left to ask, or?
Me? I don't think so.
Okay, well,
Oh, there's one more question.
okay, great.
Do you think that social media making culture so much more accessible makes living in a city less critical for artists? That's interesting.
I do. I also think it's kind of, I have really weird views on this because I think we've seen in the last decade or 2 decades, this sort of disintegration of sort of regionality. Like, you know, when I was a kid, you heard about like, oh, Atlanta has its own rap sound, or DC has its own hardcore sound. You know, and you've definitely kind of seen the sort of disintegration of that, and I think that's a little troubling. But on the other side, on the other side of the coin, things like social media, things like YouTube, things like SoundCloud, you know, a kid could make the best zombie movie of the year and just upload it to TikTok. You know, it's like a 2-minute, like, just little, like, messing around sort of, I don't know, just kind of like messing around and like making like a weird little movie, and it's like the best thing you've seen all year. You know, and having that access to those kinds of things and being able to sort of share what you've created. And, you know, like what Alana said earlier with like Etsy, like people can live in places all over and make stuff and possibly make a living off of it. So, you know, it goes beyond social media, but the internet in general, I think, has definitely made it possible for people to be artists. And they've always been able to do that. You could always be an artist anywhere you want to be. Just sometimes the city has benefits that the suburbs don't. Like, you can network and you can, you know, meet people. And I'm starting to see more people outside of the cities, at least in my world, like writers. I'm starting to see like their Twitter presence has really helped their careers, and it doesn't matter where they live. So that's a good thing. So yeah, I do think social media has definitely had a huge impact on that.
Great. And I think we have one more question. No, never mind.
No? Okay.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. That's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to our guests and to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Again, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of The Sprawl, please click the green button at the bottom of your screen. We're also accepting donations on our website. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us in Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.